Necromancer is a spec in Guild Wars 2. That doesn't fall under questioning. And neither does for anyone with monochrome of independent thought and ability to comprehend reality that Guild Wars 2 suffers from a lot of past mistakes, in equal measure fairly recent short-sighted decisions, and decade-old fundamental errors of its base class design. And those errors are about to surface hard and soon make Necromancer the enemy of the people #1, like Willbender used to be and Spear Spellbreaker before him. And once again, Arena will most likely use a nerf equivalent of a chainsaw to fix a problem requiring surgical precision, effectively nerfing everything but the problem, like they did with Willbender and like they did with Spear Spellbreaker before him. And hence I make this video. Not to call for nerfs, not to argue against them, simply to underline what's the most abrasive about the class and what is most likely to make people call for nerfs, in hopes Arena can do better job than they did in the past. If you agree with my takes, like, subscribe, consider supporting. If you don't, comment moderation is off, teach me a new slur. Anyway, Necromancer, as all classes did, was originally designed almost 13 years ago for an iteration of Guild Wars 2 that doesn't exist anymore. And if you could read, you'd already know that it basically spells disaster, even before we add the following. Necromancer is a health tank that gets punished for health tanking, and that's its basic gameplay premise. Necromancer's class mechanic is the Death Shroud, a transformation with its own health bar and its own skills, that you can upkeep for as long as you have the Shroud health. Meaning, Necromancer can be forced out of its own mechanic by a burst of damage. Of course, this doesn't affect Scourge, who just shits AoE barrier, and Harbinger, who doesn't tank with Shroud health. But in terms of its base design, it remains true. Necromancer is a tank that gets punished for tanking, and ArenaNet had to balance him around it. Essentially, overbuff it or remove that interaction entirely, like they did with Scourge and Harbinger. Mark my words, Ritualist won't have conventional Shroud either, because even ANET figured out that Shroud itself is a balancing nightmare. But when we ask ourselves why exactly is Shroud a balancing nightmare, we eventually notice three things. Firstly, Necromancer under high enough damage pressure won't be able to use his class mechanic, as it will be continuously forced out of Shroud by enemy damage, which is simply unfun for the Necromancer. Secondly, Necromancer's base health, his healing, amount of barrier he can have and generate, and his Shroud health are more often than not fixed numbers, meaning he will have fixed maximum amount of those no matter what. And most importantly, in a teamfight, the Necromancer will take much more damage than he will in a 1v1, but will most likely have the same amount of base resources to work with. Sure, you can point at per target healing and Shroud generation, but with how per target generation scales in PvP and World v World, for example, Reaper, to double the life force generation it gets from hitting just one person with Your Soul is Mine, would have to hit with it at least 4 people, regardless if we count in melee hits or not. Double the resources against quadruple the damage threat is clearly not one-to-one scaling, meaning Necromancer in a 1v1 will have much more resources per enemy present than in any teamfight scenario, which in turn means that Necro, with its current scaling, is very difficult to balance both for teamfights and for 1v1s, as it will either have too little health and damage mitigation for teamfights and be weak, or have too much health and damage mitigation in 1v1s, making them resource expensive to peel off of a side node, which gives off an illusion of Necro being overpowered in 1v1s. Moreover, the longer Necro stays alive in combat, the more resources it can generate, through rotating its abilities, life siphon and any other means, making burst damage its main weakness, and once again, making the generally lower damage threat in 1v1s give off an illusion that Necro is very broken on side note. And if you don't have enough damage to force Necro out of Shroud consistently and still be able to threaten his normal health bar, you're going to have to deal with all its bloody bullshit. And there's bullshit aplenty, because Necromancer's gameplay surrounds the idea of crippling the enemy with conditions. Forget the condition damage, we're just talking about debilitating effects over here, such as cripple, blindness, weakness, chill, and healing reduction from poison. Not to mention whatever buffs from Bone Corrupt, which is also Necromancer's shtick. Because those effects are so present in Necro's toolkit that even power builds often end up relatively condition spammy, fights against Necromancers often end up a cleanse or resistance check, like CC spam builds are stability checks. That of course is unfun, especially when some of those conditions are borderline comparable in power to hard CC, and others, like Fear, just are hard CC. Fear is just as potent as any hard CC, and lets Necro build a distance between himself and the opponents, effectively soft countering melee builds. Chill, on the other hand, has a much more nuanced effect. Chill slows the rate at which skill cooldowns tick down, including cooldowns of whatever cleanse options you have that you would normally use to cleanse the chill, leading to Necromancers winning on cooldown war by default, even if you are actively cleansing the chill as often as you can. There always will be those incremental fractions of seconds that you'll lose here and there, and those will just keep adding up, until you realize you're 3 seconds away from your cleanse coming off cooldown and you have 7 seconds of chill and weakness applied to you, meaning you move at snail's pace, your CDs aren't coming up, and your endurance is draining. All the while, Necro is just winding up their biggest CC chain. But that's not all. Unholy Sanctuary is a trait in death magic that makes you regenerate health whilst in Shroud, and makes it so if you have enough life force to enter Shroud, you'll do so automatically instead of going down if you misplay and eat a lethal combo. You don't get killed for your mistake, you just go into Shroud, which you'd like to do manually anyway if you got CC locked, for example, because Shroud has a passive damage reduction built in, so it's a good way to reduce the punishment you take. All the trait does is activate the Shroud for you, meaning it's essentially an equivalent of training wheels, so you don't get punished for playing like a Pepega. Then of course we can swing around and come at the aforementioned damage reduction. Necro by default takes less damage in Shroud, and when I checked last time it was 50% damage reduction for both Reaper and Core Necro in PvP and World v World. On top of which, protection can be stacked, toughness steroids can be stacked, and in Reaper's case, infusing terror can be stacked on top of the base Shroud damage reduction. But that's the thing, the base value you get for basically existing is 50% damage reduction. I am okay with infusing terror, stacking traits, stacking protection, etc., because that are things Necro has to at least do something for. Straight up 50% damage reduction for getting punched in the face until Unholy Sanctuary triggers is not something that looks good either on paper or in practice. Which, by the way, is followed by the undisputable fact that Necromancer's skills are often quite easy to connect. All staff skills are AoE, majority of Necro's pressure are AoE, and often multi-hitting AoE on top of that, or at least persistent AoE. Take Core Shroud 4 and 5 for example, take Reaper's Shouts, take Flipping Harbinger Shroud 5, Take all the AoE bullshit Scourge vomits. Take the fact that Torch 5, a single target point-and-click CC, is a fucking AoE. It does nothing to secondary targets. It doesn't even have option to hit secondary targets. It's just made that way for flavor or some shit, but ends up being more forgiving as a result. And this shouldn't even be what we fixate on. Reaper has shout range AoE fucking stun that goes through walls, applies chill to all targets hit, grants him stability and quickness on hit, and has 48 seconds of cooldown. It's borderline impossible to cast a shout in a teamfight and not hit anything. I honestly challenge you to try. But that's besides the point. The amount of value Necromancer gets essentially without the need for good positioning, for clever cooldown management, without even as much as consciously pressuring targets, is noticeably greater than that for any other class in the game. That doesn't mean Necro is skillless. I met some very skilled Necromancers over the years, and many took the opportunity to humble me with great pleasure. That simply means a statistical bad player will fare a little better playing Necromancer than playing other classes when facing other bad players. And that's not even the end of the issues at play. Necromancer's weaknesses, stemming from its initial design, have all been alleviated or completely removed over the years. Its low mobility? No longer a thing, with access to relics of speed or wayfinder and weapons like swords and spear. Its pitiful stability access was just swept away with new transfusion, giving self-stability on staff 5. And alleviating its susceptibility to burst damage is pretty much the entire point of death magic as a whole. As of right now, Necromancers just don't really have a clear defined weakness. However, that's still not the crux of the issue at stake. The problem isn't that Necromancer is a health tank. The problem isn't that Necromancer is exponentially stronger in 1v1s. The problem isn't that Necromancer is over-reliant on debilitating conditions. The problem isn't that Necromancer is forgiving to bad players. The problem isn't that Necromancer is doing much more damage with tank stats than it should. The problem isn't that Necromancer has no clear defined weakness. The problem is that Necromancer does all of that at the same time, and that simply makes them overbearing to fight across the board, regardless of class's actual power level. Its power perception will always be skewed due to aforementioned reasons. But one thing will remain consistent. Until Arena makes difference between good Necro and a bad Necro more noticeable, people will complain. Until Arena makes Necro stop gaining value by default, people will complain. Until Arena makes Necro just unforgiving enough to stop it from putting bad players in lobbies they don't belong in, people will complain. And Arena will eventually cave in and nerf something. And the scary part is that, as I already alluded to, Arena have a tendency to nerf things around the problem. Like they nerfed full counter cooldown instead of fixing the bug that gave it double the cooldown reduction from versatile power trait. Or like they kept nerfing classes that abused overpowered relics instead of nerfing those overpowered relics first. So this is the question to all the Necromains who see this video. Would you rather have Necro get less easy value but have higher skill expression, or for it to be balanced around getting that easy value? I would of course rather have the first option, so I can still get shut on by good Necromancers in Platinum lobbies. And I would stop getting opponents who installed the game yesterday, because punching down on newbies isn't fun, even for a bloody twat such as myself. And with that finishing touch, big sign of gratitude towards all the generous supporters that continuously consider my dubious quality content worth their money. You're all truly welcome. Crabface out.